Hi, my name is Steve Keating, and I'm the Associate Director for Speaking at the Writing and Speaking Studio. And in this section of the course, I'd like to continue the conversation that Brian and Sarah just started about communication, but I'd like to focus it on the type of technology that we use in a remote teaching environment. Now, fortunately, as faculty members, we have a lot of options available to us when it comes to tools and platforms and tech that are designed specifically to make our jobs working remotely easier. Unfortunately, that great number of options can also be a little bit overwhelming for faculty members who are brand new to teaching remotely, or maybe just aren't as confident implementing technology in their courses. For that reason, in this video, I'd like to talk with you about just one technology that, when well considered and well applied, can accomplish all of the things that we want to accomplish in a remote teaching environment. That technology is slide technology. PowerPoint, Google Slides are two of the most common examples. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the considerations that we need to make in order to have this technology be effective and work for us and work for our students. However, before we start to talk about those considerations that we need to make in order to implement slide technology effectively in our courses, we need to talk about what it is that we are intending to accomplish in our remote space. Now, this has been talked about earlier in the course in multiple sections, I believe, but this needs to be reiterated now due to the fact that we need to keep these tenets in mind with every decision that we make regarding the planning and practice of slide technology in our courses. The first thing that we need to do is make sure that we're meeting our course objectives and outcomes, the same objectives and outcomes that we would be meeting in a face-to-face environment. We also need to ensure that all voices are heard. Faculty and students must be able to communicate within this environment freely and clearly. And last, we need to encourage interaction, question asking, and collaboration among students and between students and faculty. Now, as I read through these, you may be thinking that these are the same goals that we would have for a face-to-face environment, and that is true. And that's an important thing to notice. The goals of a remote teaching space, or the goals of using a remote technology, are no different than the goals for a face-to-face environment. It's how we meet those goals that changes. Now that we've talked about our remote teaching goals again and have those in mind, we can start to talk about the considerations that I mentioned before. I said that slide technology, when well considered and well applied, can accomplish all of the things that we hope to accomplish in a remote teaching environment. Again, everything that we just mentioned. But when I say well considered, what I'm talking about is the consideration of both the utility and design of the slide technology as it is included in your course. Although fully remote teaching is new to almost all of us, we also all have different levels of experience and comfort with the process. If you're interested in following up about anything in this section of the course, feel free to do so. Or if you'd like to talk about these topics on a more foundational level, or if you're further along in your progress and would like to discuss some advanced strategies, reach out to any of us directly. We're happy to sit down with you in a virtual meeting and talk. We look forward to working with you. When I say that we need to consider utility, I mean that we need to have an understanding of the purpose of a presentation and all its parts. Also that we need to have an understanding of how each part helps us to convey our message and motivate active learning, participation, and interaction among students. When I say that we need to consider design, I'm talking about an understanding of the basic layout of our slides, and also an understanding of the impact that our design decisions can make on students' perceptions and ability to learn. These are pretty straightforward considerations, but they do need to be made. When ignored, oftentimes our slide presentations can be less effective, and at its worst, they can actually make learning more difficult for students. So let's talk about that first consideration, utility. Specifically, we're going to talk about understanding purpose. That's the purpose of the PowerPoint in general, and also the purpose of your PowerPoint, and also then establishing an agenda. Next, we're going to talk about communicating your agenda with narrative and scaffolding. And last, we're going to talk about creating opportunities for interaction. After all of that, we'll move on to design. We'll start with understanding the topics of purpose and establishing an agenda. Firstly, what is your purpose for using slide technology? I think this is an important question to answer because often when we use tech or tools without really considering why we want to use them or how we want to use them, we tend to use them ineffectively. For me, a slide presentation is all about establishing a narrative around a lesson, delivering that lesson in a clear way, and creating opportunities for interaction and collaboration. It doesn't even need to be that complicated, though. As Sarah pointed out earlier, we choose to use the platforms and technologies we do based on which ones best support the delivery of our content. Maybe we find a certain tool or platform most effective, or maybe we find one more convenient than the rest. Your purpose for using slide technology may be as simple as that. But whatever the reason, taking the time to identify your purpose for using it in your remote course can guide you in the ways that you apply it and interact with it. So it may be worth the thought. After thinking about your purpose for using slide technology, you can start to think about the purpose of the individual presentation that you're currently putting together. I like to call the purpose of my presentation an agenda. In my mind, every slide presentation is strategic, and there should be something in particular that you hope your students will know by the time they're done working through, listening to, or interacting with the lesson. The main takeaway that you intend can be considered your overall agenda. And everything that you include within the presentation can clearly and orderly work toward supporting that point. To make sure that everything included within the presentation works toward that overall agenda, it can also be helpful to develop slide agendas. What's the purpose of the slide? What do I need for my students to know before they move on to the next one? Now, let's acknowledge that this approach is potentially a whole lot more regimented than the way you would approach a lesson in the classroom. And that makes sense because in face-to-face interactions, we have a lot to fall back on that isn't structure. If we feel that students are getting lost, we can stop and repeat ourselves. We can pay attention to their nonverbals and gauge whether the lesson is connecting. Students hopefully feel comfortable enough to raise their hands, ask us to repeat something, or just let us know that they're not understanding. In the remote classroom, a lot of that's gone, limited, or more difficult to attend to. Plus, in our current circumstances, so much is up in the air, and so much of our world is uncertain and ambiguous. With that in mind, I feel better offering my students something concise and with clear expectations for their learning. Certainly there can be and should be room left for free-form exploration of topics and lessons, but we can introduce those opportunities as such and still rely on highly structured lessons elsewhere. In my opinion, in this case, if you feel like you're structuring your lessons a bit too much, it's probably just right. Think back to what Brian and Sarah shared with us in the last section. On numerous occasions, we've heard students say that they wish their remote classes were more structured, and that course and assignment expectations were communicated more clearly. Lastly, I'll say that it takes some time to determine your agenda for your presentation, and certainly for each slide, if you choose to go that far. Anytime I've done it, though, I received positive feedback and felt much more confident that my lesson was communicated the way I wanted it to be, and that my students had the chance to interact with it and question it the way that they should. Once we've established our agenda for the overall presentation and maybe even for each slide, we can start to think about how to communicate that agenda to the students. And to be clear, I don't just mean the lesson behind the agenda. I believe that we can communicate the agenda itself. We can uncover the scaffolding and show the students how each part of our presentation connects to the next. None of this needs to happen behind the scenes. In order to communicate our agenda effectively, we can do two things. The first one is to use clear, concise, and unambiguous statements for clear expectations. Using statements like these at key points in our presentation, for example at the beginning and even end of each slide, is a helpful technique because it takes the guesswork out of a lesson. As opposed to simply sharing a lot of information about a certain topic or chapter and hoping that students take away what we need them to take away, we can introduce the topic and then explain to our students our agenda for that material, what we need them to know or think about or question or try or do by the end of the presentation. And with that information, they will know what to listen for.
which can make the process a little easier on their end. If we want the learning to be more exploratory and feel like a highly structured framework would get in the way, we can set expectations for a more free-form type of conversation too. Whatever type of interaction we want to facilitate with our slides, we can introduce it clearly. When teaching, I find that students are more inclined and willing to participate and invest in a learning environment when they know what's expected of them and they understand their role in that process. In all of this, I go back to the student and the circumstances. Things are chaotic, and their education doesn't have to be. The second way that we can communicate our agenda is to employ narrative and avoid lists. Briefly, I'll say that students remember stories and not bullet points. For this reason, I recommend developing a narrative around your lesson, as I've done here. Although most faculty do this without thinking in the classroom, sometimes when transferring content to the remote space, lessons get watered down to talking points and vocabulary. Although you can see I use bulleted lists on my slides, I make sure to tell stories around them. Sometimes we can get anchored to the lists and end up not sharing much beyond them. So, just as a reminder, let's use our personal and professional experiences to enrich the content. Again, students remember stories and not bullet points.
The last point I'd like to discuss in consideration of the utility of slide technology is our responsibility to build in opportunities for interaction. Again, interaction and collaboration are main goals in remote teaching, all teaching, and also in our use of slide technology. And when I say that we need to build in these opportunities, it's because they don't always show up organically in a remote space, especially when we've got a large number of students in the course. And there are plenty of reasons for why these moments don't just happen. Technical problems, students not wanting to stop the flow of conversation, people talking over each other and not knowing it, the professor maybe not even being aware that anyone has a question or comment, the speed of the class, apprehension, motivation. That list goes on. And for that reason, we can't leave it up to chance. Interaction and collaboration are important, so we need to ensure that they happen. The way that I do this is by including checkpoints in the slide presentation. Checkpoints are slides devoted to stopping the lesson, interrupting the agenda and the narrative, and taking time to regroup and check that everybody's where they need to be. You can also think about this just as part of the agenda, part of the narrative. But we can do this in a couple different ways. We can open up for questions, we can engage in an activity of some kind, or whatever you think of. I generally use questions in my checkpoints. Take a few minutes for the questions, whether the students ask them or not. It's important that they know that there's time available. And you can tell them that it's coming up too, so that they can plan for it. They can jot down questions that they have or comments that they'd like to make. That way, the flow of the course isn't interrupted. A faculty member doesn't have to worry about whether they're missing questions from the students. There's this time allotted for exactly that. You can put your checkpoint after every main point or so. This helps because it gives us a clearer read on what our students are understanding. If students seem confused at the end of a whole class, for example, we may not know where things went wrong or what it is that they're not understanding. You may forget, they may forget. But if a student's unsure of the lesson after 15 minutes, it's much more manageable to think about why and to try to rectify that. If nobody is asking questions, it's an idea to require them. Maybe a muddiest points type of exercise could be employed, in which all students write down or send in through the class chat the point that they're least certain about. Or I know I've heard the advice at some point, as opposed to asking, does anybody have any questions? Ask, what questions do you have? Make this a norm in your class and encourage students to ask questions as well as you can. We can make question asking an integral part of the slide presentations and the course, and in doing so, we're ensuring that our students are heard and hopefully get a better grasp on the lesson itself. We can also use the checkpoint as a time to gauge student learning through an activity. Maybe we want to ask them to do a reverse lecture. Students are split into groups and are required to share their screens to give a 1-minute summary of what they just learned from the last 15 minutes. Maybe it's an opportunity to have them write in the discussion board and comment on each other's posts. Maybe it's time for a think, pair, share activity. Maybe you'd like them to jump to another program or platform such as VoiceThread or Padlet, which Jose Diaz will talk about at different points in this course. Maybe there's a good time to break from the presentation for a while, have the students conduct some research, and then reflect on it with their peers after you reconvene. You can do anything during these checkpoints that helps to support your main agenda. I'm still working toward that. Whether it's in the slide presentation or not, this framework makes it feel structured and provides students with an understanding of the why behind each part of the lesson. And again, when students know what they're doing and why, they are often more invested. So take 5 minutes or even take an hour for this checkpoint. Again, anything can be in this space, but it's a great opportunity for students to get their bearings. And it's also an easy spot to pick back up on and then transition into something else.
At this point, we've talked about considering the utility of using slide technology in your course. Again, when we understand the purpose of a slide presentation, learn how to develop and communicate a clear agenda for our lessons, and figure out the best way for ourselves to facilitate meaningful interaction through the technology, we can be more confident about the effectiveness of using slides in our course. Now, let's try out one of the checkpoints we just talked about. The purpose of this one will be to have you reflect on a few of the points we discussed. In a way, these questions serve as a worksheet of sorts that can help you get down on paper some information that can be helpful in planning slide presentations for your individual classes. I encourage you to take some time here for that reason. If it would be helpful, you can even think about bringing what you write into a meeting with me so that we can discuss your process. Remember though, your checkpoints can ask questions, introduce an activity, or something else entirely.
Now let's talk about the design consideration of slide technology. First, we're going to talk about the slide design philosophy, what we feel the role is of a slide presentation in a remote teaching course, and then we're going to talk about certain design practicalities, specifically regarding written content and visual content. Certainly there are more considerations to be made regarding design, but these are the basics. This is what needs to be covered in order for our course to be effective, in order for our slide to be an effective component of it. In terms of overall slide design, my philosophy is that slides should be intentional, simple, and actionable. Intentional slides are slides that are designed with their purpose in mind. Each word means something in the agenda of the slide. Each image means something in the agenda of the slide. Each slide plays a part in the grander agenda of the presentation. Simple slides are slides that have what they need and nothing else. Sometimes that can be a few words, like I have here, accompanied by voice, of course. Sometimes it's a bit more than that. Other times it might just be pictures, but certainly there's nothing unnecessary. There is something to be said about including design elements that are meant to make the presentation more aesthetically pleasing. That certainly works, as long as that element doesn't get in the way of the clarity of the message. So basically, we just need to avoid anything that's overly distracting. Actionable slides are slides that promote thinking, discussion, collaboration, and activity. Although this is not possible with every single slide, I generally strive to get a reaction from my students with each slide that I work through. If not a reaction, that slide should build toward a discussion that can break out from the slide, or an activity that can complement what's being discussed there.
Beyond the basic philosophy of slide design, there are a handful of practicalities that can be helpful to keep in mind regarding both the written and visual content of slides. Let's start with the written content. First, the dilemma of too much information versus too little information. Now, how much information is the right amount has a lot to do with your purpose for using your slides. Some faculty members develop slide presentations to be used as study guides for their students, and so those slides would just stand alone. And for those faculty members, it may make sense to include more information on each slide. However, if you're using your slides as a way to communicate your content in a synchronous lecture, or want to record that lecture so that it can be referred back to later, it may make more sense to go light on the content. The reason for this is that too much information creates an information overload. Especially when content is new or challenging for listeners, too much information can obviously be difficult to take in. The perception process involves organizing and interpreting information, So when we try to communicate too much all at once, the listener doesn't have the time to do all the sense-making necessary. In that case, they may miss some information, they may confuse some information, or they may get frustrated, shut off, and really not get much of it at all. Maybe surprisingly, too little information is also a problem, depending on your delivery. As you can see, I've included very limited information on these slides. And if I was just running through this as a list without doing too much explaining or contextualizing, there wouldn't be enough to pay attention to, which can cause students to disconnect. The next point is about what we should write versus what we should speak out in a lecture. Although there are no absolutes, and no decision in one way or another is objectively right or wrong, I tend to only write what I feel is needed to keep students on track with the discussion. Unless a specific definition, quote, or excerpt is needed for the student to understand a concept, I let most of the written content just serve as a guide and instead rely on my lecturing and all student interactions to make and explore the points. This point leads to the next one, redundancy. In deciding what to write versus what to say, many people choose to do both. With the best interest of the student in mind, they feel sending the message in two ways is better than just one, either one. What I found in my own classes is that this tends to cause problems. It's difficult to both listen and read at the same time. Also, we can think more quickly than others can speak, so even if we're reading exactly what someone is saying, we're likely not at the same point. What this does is again complicate the perception process. Basically, it's more difficult to take in two streams of messaging over one. And this gets even more complicated in the remote space when students are also balancing their listening with attending to different technological needs and any distractions at home. Now let's talk about the visual content. The first point I'd like to make is about what we include and why. I mentioned earlier that there's something to be said about including elements within your slide presentations that are there simply to make the presentation more pleasing to the eyes. That is all well and good as long as it doesn't get in the way of the message. Beyond making the presentation look nice, however, we also often include visual content like images, graphics, animations, and videos. At times, we have more visual content than written content, and all of that can work. At times, though, what I found is that some of this content is included just to be included, because it is in the same topic or subject. To ensure clarity and avoid any frustration from students, I try to make sure that all of the visual content I'm including, explaining, and discussing with them has a clear purpose. If it's not needed, I don't include it, and instead use that time for more meaningful discussion. Now, I make that decision based on a self-check that I've developed. I ask myself, does the visual content I'm including either verify, clarify, or exemplify the point I'm needing to make? If the content is serving one of those purposes, I include it, and then explain the role that it's playing to my students as I present. If it falls outside of those, and I still want to include it, then I work to explain that in my agenda to the students. Lastly, a major practical step that we can take with including visual content in our presentations is to explain it, as I said above, and even if its inclusion seems obvious to us, and also transition in and out of it. I've seen many presentations in which an image, a graph, or a video is dropped into the narrative without explanation, or sometimes the speaker offers something like, and here's a video, or here's a graph, and then they move on. And really, I think that this is sometimes because of how much thought the speaker put into it. They put so much thought into it that they forget their reasoning isn't clear to everyone else. My suggestion is to transition in and out of any visuals, introduce them, talk about what should be paid attention to while looking at them, or explain why it's relevant, and then talk about how that may lead to the next point. Let's try another checkpoint. Again, feel free to take your time with these questions because the answers to them can be very helpful in both planning and implementing slide technology in your remote course. As I said earlier, you're welcome to bring whatever you write to a meeting with me if that would be helpful.
In this section of the course, we've covered two basic considerations that need to be made when implementing slide technology in a remote course. Those considerations, utility and design. I hope through this talk you've seen the true potential of slide technology in your remote course, and also can see how truly dynamic and complete it can be when well considered and well applied. However, please know that although I'm saying slide technology is fairly comprehensive, I'm not suggesting that we can't or shouldn't use any other platforms or different types of technology. Certainly those are available. So if you're interested in branching out to a different platform or technology, or you see in your class a need for something beyond slides, then definitely look into that. If you are interested in exploring those platforms now, the next section of the course will be of particular interest. Jose Diaz, our online learning manager, will be talking about two programs in particular that you can use separately or that can complement slides very well.